Fellow soil enthusiasts, if you've ever stood over your worm bin wondering why it smells like a swamp instead of rich earth, or why your red wigglers seem more sluggish than energetic, you're not alone. After 8 weeks of rigorous testing with 3 completely different feeding approaches, I've uncovered the feeding strategy that will revolutionize your vermicomposting success. What I discovered will challenge everything you think you know about feeding worms. Before we dive into the game-changing results, let's address the elephant in the room. Most of us approach worm feeding like we're feeding pets, tossing in kitchen scraps whenever we remember, without considering the delicate ecosystem we're trying to maintain. This haphazard approach leads to the 3 most common vermicomposting disasters: anaerobic conditions that create putrid odors, food that sits untouched for weeks creating pest problems, and worms that reproduce slowly or appear stressed and inactive. The truth is, your feeding strategy determines whether you'll harvest rich, crumbly vermicompost or end up with a slimy, smelly mess. Your worms aren't just garbage disposals. They're sophisticated decomposers that thrive under specific conditions. The way you prepare and deliver their food directly impacts their health, reproduction rate, and the quality of castings they produce. For this comprehensive test, I set up 3 identical worm bins, each housing approximately 500 red wigglers in the same bedding mixture. The only variable was the feeding strategy, and the differences were dramatic from day 1. Bin 1 received the traditional whole scraps method that most beginners use. I added kitchen scraps in their natural form, banana peels, coffee grounds, vegetable trimmings, and eggshells, burying them in different corners of the bin each week. This mirrors how most people start their vermicomposting journey, simply adding whatever organic waste they generate. Bin 2 got the blended approach, where all food scraps were processed in a food processor until they reached a chunky salsa consistency before being mixed into the bedding. This method requires more preparation time but theoretically should speed decomposition since the food particles have more surface area exposed to the worms and beneficial microorganisms. Bin 3 followed what I call the bedding-rich method, where food scraps were chopped into small pieces and then layered with equal parts fresh carbon-rich bedding materials like shredded newspaper, cardboard, and dried leaves. Each feeding session included a 1-to-1 ratio of food scraps to new bedding material, maintaining optimal carbon-to-nitrogen balance throughout the process. By week 2, distinct patterns emerged that would only intensify as the experiment continued. The whole scraps bin showed signs of stress almost immediately. Food items sat largely untouched, creating pockets of anaerobic decomposition. The banana peels developed a slimy coating, and fruit flies began appearing despite the bin being properly covered. The worms seemed to avoid these areas, clustering in the corners with older, more decomposed material. The blended scraps bin initially appeared promising, with food disappearing more quickly than the whole scraps method. However, by week 3, moisture levels became problematic. The pre-processed food created a wet, compact environment that reduced airflow. While the worms were more active than in bin 1, they weren't thriving as expected, and some areas of the bin developed an unpleasant sour odor. Meanwhile, the bedding-rich bin was becoming a worm paradise. The combination of small food pieces and abundant carbon material created perfect conditions for both worms and beneficial microorganisms. The bin maintained ideal moisture levels naturally, never developing odors, and the worm population appeared more active and distributed throughout the entire bin, rather than clustering in small areas. At the 6-week mark, the differences became undeniable. The whole scraps bin had become a cautionary tale of what not to do. Despite adding the same amount of food as the other bins, much remained unprocessed. The worm population appeared stressed, with many worms attempting to escape through drainage holes. The few castings produced were inconsistent in texture and showed signs of anaerobic processing. The blended scraps bin had overcome its early moisture issues but revealed another problem: nutrient burn. The readily available processed food had created hotspots of intense microbial activity that the worms found uncomfortable. While more castings were produced than in bin 1, they were darker and denser than ideal, indicating incomplete processing. The bedding-rich bin had become a vermicomposting showcase. Worms were visible throughout all layers, actively feeding and reproducing. The castings being produced were light, crumbly, and sweet-smelling. Most remarkably, this bin never required moisture adjustment or odor management. It self-regulated beautifully. After 8 full weeks, the results were conclusive and frankly shocking in their clarity. The bedding-rich feeding strategy didn't just win, it dominated every measurable category. This bin produced 40% more finished vermicompost than the blended method and nearly triple the output of the whole scraps approach. The castings quality was superior, testing higher in beneficial microorganisms and showing better plant growth response in subsequent germination tests. The worm populations told an even more compelling story. The bedding-rich bin showed evidence of active reproduction, with numerous cocoons visible throughout the bedding and small juvenile worms present in significant numbers. The other bins showed minimal reproduction activity, with worms appearing to focus on survival rather than thriving. Perhaps most importantly for home vermicomposters, the bedding-rich method required the least intervention. No odor problems, no moisture adjustments, no pest issues, and no escaping worms. It created a stable, self-managing ecosystem that produced consistent results week after week. The bedding-rich method succeeds because it mimics natural decomposition processes. In nature, organic matter doesn't decompose in isolation, it breaks down surrounded by carbon-rich materials that balance moisture, provide structure for airflow, and create habitat for beneficial microorganisms. By maintaining this 1-to-1 ratio of food scraps to fresh bedding with each feeding, you're creating optimal conditions for both worms and the microbial communities they depend on. Start implementing this strategy by chopping your food scraps into pieces roughly the size of a grape. This increases surface area for faster decomposition while avoiding the moisture problems of completely processed food. Prepare bedding materials by shredding newspaper, cardboard, or collecting dried leaves, keeping them slightly damp but not wet. Each time you feed, add equal volumes of chopped scraps and fresh bedding, mixing gently into the top few inches of your bin. Feed your worms using this method only when the previous feeding has been substantially processed, usually every 7 to 10 days for an established bin. This approach naturally regulates feeding frequency and prevents overfeeding, one of the most common vermicomposting mistakes. This method works because it addresses the 3 critical factors for successful vermicomposting: proper carbon-to-nitrogen ratio, adequate airflow, and moisture regulation. The continuous addition of carbon-rich bedding maintains the ideal 25-to-1 to 30-to-1 carbon-to-nitrogen ratio that supports both rapid decomposition and healthy worm populations. The bedding materials create physical structure that prevents compaction, ensuring oxygen reaches all areas of the bin. This prevents anaerobic conditions that create odors and toxic compounds harmful to worms. Additionally, the carbon materials act as moisture buffers, absorbing excess water from food scraps while providing humidity as they gradually decompose. Transform your vermicomposting success starting today by implementing this proven bedding-rich feeding strategy. Your worms will reward you with superior castings, healthier populations, and a trouble-free composting experience that makes vermicomposting the joy it should be. Ready to revolutionize your gardening with more evidence-based growing strategies? Subscribe to the Living Soil Lab for weekly experiments, tests, and proven techniques that deliver real results in your garden. Share this guide with fellow gardeners who are ready to take their soil health to the next level. Together, we're building a community of soil scientists, one worm bin at a time.